Hello and welcome. I'm Andrew Bishop, the Assistant Head of School here at the Alexander Dawson School. I want to welcome everyone to our first Parent University session of the year. Challenge success, born out of the research of Dr. Denise Pope at Stanford University, stresses the importance of schools creating proactive and positive partnerships with their parent body. To that end, and as Nevada's only Challenge Success school, Parent University is designed to provide Dawson parents with tools, strategies, and research for how they can partner with our school in the education, academic development, and social emotional growth of their children. Today, we have the supreme pleasure of welcoming clinical psychologist and New York Times bestselling author, Dr. Michael Thompson, to our Parent University series. For over 35 years, Dr. Thompson has worked as a clinical psychologist, school consultant, and international speaker on the subjects of children, schools, and parenting. He is the author of 9 books, including Raising Cain and most recently, Homesick and Happy. Dr. Thompson has worked with independent schools and public school districts throughout the United States and with international schools in Europe, Asia, and South America. He is currently the consulting psychologist at the Belmont Hill School, an all-boys day school in Belmont, Massachusetts. On a personal level, I had the honor of meeting Dr. Thompson more than 5 years ago while I was working at Berwick Academy. And while I'm not sure that Dr. Thompson remembers me, I can assure you that his talk left an indelible mark on me as an educator and father. I know that today's conversation will do the same. Before I formally turn it over to Dr. Thompson, a few housekeeping notes. Dr. Thompson will talk for about 35 minutes on the subject of parenting in a pandemic. During that time, we'll ask all of our parents, if they do have questions, to leave those questions and as much information about their child or family in the chat box as possible. We'll then, at the end, have about a 30-minute time for question and answer, where I will work with Dr. Thompson to answer as many of those questions as possible. And then we hope to end our 90-minute session with a couple brave parents, if we can pull it off technologically, to raise their hands and perhaps get on screen and to share their questions with Dr. Thompson and the rest of our parent community as well. While we wish we could welcome Dr. Thompson to our beautiful campus and that we know we would love to engage with him in person, we're honored to have him join us, and we know that the subject of this discussion is apropos for the time. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Thompson to Parent University. Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Andrew. That was lovely, particularly the personal piece about the impact I had on you. That's very gratifying, obviously, for me. I hope that I can be useful for you Alexander Dawson parents today and anybody from other schools who've also tuned in. I have been in touch with parents literally around the world since the beginning of this pandemic. I have made my living these last 20 years as a speaker and school consultant, visiting schools, maybe as many as 50 a year. And my calendar, of course, was just swept clean. And I had no work last March, and all of a sudden I was living a life on Zoom. And it has enabled me to go to schools in Hong Kong and schools across, international schools across the Mideast and in Europe, and from one end of the United States to the other, literally from Maine to Hawaii to Florida. I guess not Alaska at this point. So I know something about the fears of parents and the challenges that parents are facing. This has been the most stressful parenting time I've ever seen in my 50 years of being associated with schools. I started as a teacher, middle school teacher at the age of 23. I'm 73. And I have never seen parents under such strain and dealing with challenges that they never imagined they would have to deal with. So I'm going to touch on these things, but you've lived it. So I hope this resonates for you, this quick list. But first of all, every family has had to deal with a fear of death. A fear of death for themselves. Could COVID-19 take me? Could COVID-19 take my aging parents? could it take my child with a immunosuppressed condition, my partner who's been through chemotherapy? This is, everybody has been grappling with questions of life and death. That's just what the pandemic has brought for all of us. And it has brought for some parents an experience of talking to their children about death, which they didn't anticipate doing or didn't anticipate doing in this intense a way. So I was talking to some parents in California who had a 4.5-year-old daughter who seemed to be asking about death all the time. And they were putting her off. They didn't want to tell her because they didn't want to scare her that COVID could kill people. And they told her grandfather was wearing a mask because it was like a carnival or a festival or a joke or something. They were lying to her. They were lying to her about life and death. And 4.5 to 5.5-year-old children are interested in death. They're interested in the death of animals. It's between around 5 to 5.5 that you get the idea that death is permanent. And so it was developmentally appropriate for the child to be asking these questions, but making the parents extremely uncomfortable because they'd never imagined talking about death to their 4.5-year-old. But she kept at him. She kept at him, and I gave them some language to address that with. But that was in the early days. I imagine you've had those conversations. All of the families had to deal with the loss of school. When schools went remote, they lost the routine, the rhythm, and the support, and frankly, the daycare aspects of school. Most parents themselves then went remote and were trying to balance their work and supervising their child who was learning remotely, or 3 children learning remotely in 3 different classrooms with 3 different remote schedules, and trying to figure out what their role was going to be with respect to being a parent and a homeschooling teacher parent, for which no one had trained, and no one, I mean, the homeschooling parents had trained to do it, but that was a tiny minority of folks, and the homeschoolers knew what to do. The rest of people were learning on the fly, and also dealing with losses, some with, actually many, with a loss of employment of one partner or another. And very often this involved a marital renegotiation, who was then able to continue to work at home, who needed to take over supervising the children. I have dear friends whose son and daughter-in-law, their life was completely disrupted because they had a grandparent who was living alone and isolated and had suffered from cancer, and the grandparent came to live with them, and the father lost his job, and he took over as the at-home parent because the wife was a physician and she was needed on the front lines of medicine. So with a aging parent with a health condition and a doctor daughter and a father now unemployed, there was immense fear and renegotiation in the family. And this has been a strain on marriages. Some people have developed a working partnership that has surprised them. Some children have found actually they like being at home this much. And some kids have adapted to this with more resilience than their parents expected or than the kids themselves expected. So I was talking to a senior class at another all-boys school in Boston last May, and the parents at the school were very, very wrought up about the loss of graduation for their sons, um, and sometimes tensions with their sons at home. And so I was talking to this whole senior class on Zoom, and one 18-year-old boy with genuine wisdom and philosophy in his voice said, when I mentioned the grief and the loss of graduation, he said, I know. He said, my parents are very upset about it. But this is our story. This is the story we're going to tell at reunions when we get together. This is our story. And you could tell he had claimed this experience. He'd made it his own. He was stepping up in the best possible way. And he was less anxious about the loss of his graduation than his parents were. Another boy in that class said to me, he said, I've gotten along better with my parents and my younger sister than I ever imagined I could. And most teenagers don't want to be spending the spring of their senior year sequestered with their mom, dad, and their younger sister. But I heard the generosity and tolerance in this 18-year-old boy. Did I think he was able to display that every day to his parents and younger sister? I do not. There's been a lot of irritability in families. There have been meltdowns. There have been some bad days. But I want to talk for a moment about children's mental health. There have been many, in all of my Zoom calls, parents have been asking me about the impact of the pandemic on their children's mental health. And I expect I'm going to get some questions about that today. So I'm going to anticipate some of them. Many parents wonder or are concerned that this is going to traumatize all children. I've actually run into some teachers who said to me with absolute conviction, all the children, when they come back to the classroom, all the children are going to be traumatized. And I said, no, that's not true. That's not true. I don't want you to see children this way. A parent wrote me a question in a chat, and she said, Dr. Thompson, would you tell me what the detrimental impact of the pandemic is going to be on children of different ages? And I said to her, we don't have any research yet on the pandemic. I don't know. And I don't know anybody who knows the answers to those questions yet. I mean, there are undoubtedly a multitude of research teams who are beginning to look at the traumatic effects of the pandemic, but the pandemic isn't over. And our research on what the first 2 months were, the first 4 months were, the first 6 or 7 months where we are now, we're not at the end. And intuitively, logically, we can imagine that the pandemic is going to have an effect on children. And the longer it goes on, the more effect will be. But I do not want you to assume that your children are being traumatized by this. Are they suffering some losses? Yes. Are they having some meltdowns? Yes. But traumatized? No. This generation of American parents is quite schooled in trauma theory. Our understanding of trauma theory came out of soldiers returning from war with PTSD, and the very strong evidence that children who are sexually abused can develop lifelong symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's not an illogical jump to imagine, oh my God, a pandemic is going to damage our children. We don't know that. So I want to tell you where I start as a trained clinical child psychologist. The vast majority of children are resilient. All children will have fragile moments, and particularly when they're with their parents, because their parents are there to hold them. Children have many more fragile moments with their parents. In an ordinary time, they have more fragile moments with their parents than they do at school, where they often present themselves at their best. So all children will have fragile moments, but children are mostly resilient, the vast majority of them. Some children are fragile to start with and are suffering from depression and anxiety. And I have seen some situations where the anxious children, their anxiety has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I have seen some children who are sad and angry about the loss of their social lives with their friends. Being locked up with your sister and your parents, for example, may not be terrible, but the loss of your friends can hit some kids really, really hard. And they yearn for their friends. And in the neighborhoods that I walk through, I'm in Arlington, Massachusetts, just northwest of Boston. I walked every day, and I saw that families were gradually enlarging their neighborhood bubbles, where they trusted their neighbors, maybe on one side, not so much as the other side, but soon I saw that there were small children playing with neighborhood children, and I realized the parents had created a bubble together, and I know families have created bubbles to try and widen their children's social lives. The tough thing is that teenagers have been breaking out from the restraints, and their parents haven't been able to say no to 14 and 15, 16-year-olds who want to get back in contact with their friends, even if schools are still on remote. And so there have been social lives. And from my point of view, just doing my informal research on my walks, 12-year-old boys who are bicycling do not wear masks. And 12 to 13 to 14-year-old girls who are walking together started out with masks, but soon the masks drop, and they're not following safety rules. And if parents know about that, it can lead to fighting. And children, of course, feel immortal. Teenagers absolutely feel immortal. Death is a hypothetical and nothing that they can imagine or actually feel. And their yearning to be together pulls them towards their peers. And that leads to conflict with whatever the safety restrictions are that you are imposing or that schools are imposing. Most children have spent a lot more time on screens than their parents had wished they might. In fact, we're all on screens all the time now, but I frequently get questions about, are children going to end up being addicted to screens? And how much should I try and limit it? And I will answer those questions, but it's a time of emergency. It's a prolonged emergency now, but it's a time of emergency, and children are going to be on screens more, and children from the age of 10 up are going to be conducting their social lives on screens in order to remain safe. And when we keep them from their friends, they're going to be on screens. And I am not imagining that we're going to come out with a whole bunch of screen addicted children any more than we're all ourselves addicted. I want to remind you that the average American adult, even before the pandemic, interacted with his or her cell phone 200 times a day. So you see if that's true of you. Try and keep track. But our kids are wedded to their devices, and you need for them to get some sleep. You have to be able to shut a server off if you've got 11 and 12-year-old boys up gaming video gaming into the night with their friends. You can't be clueless about this. But as for their daytime use, if it's social, I'm not predicting that we're going to have deleterious effects on children. I do think there should be times of the day when everybody in the family puts down their devices and has family dinner together. If you can have some meals together and some device-free meals, but this does not mean that the children are not allowed to be on their devices while mom and dad are still texting on their phones. That's the do what we say, not what we do thing, and it doesn't work for kids. We've got to model. We have to model this. I'll take more questions about this. The hardest thing for most parents is to try and figure out what their role should be in remote learning. I had a father in Los Angeles, intensely frustrated last May, and he said to me, "Dr. Thompson, my third grade son is learning on screen, and you just have to tell me what I should do to get him to pay attention the way he would do if he were in class. That's all I want. Just a couple of suggestions. How do I get him to pay attention the way he would in class?" And I could tell the father was frustrated and angry and felt quite helpless. And he was trying to enforce school without all of the structures of school. And what I said to him is, look, third graders sit down and pay attention to their teacher because all the other third graders are doing it. And they have a teacher there who is a warm, compassionate, authoritative, and possibly disciplinary presence in their lives. And she's giving him the stare, and that sits a third grade boy down. And it's his father trying to get him to pay attention to a teacher on screen. It's not going to be that easy for you. And you may not be able to get your third grade son to pay attention to pay attention for that long. And that's just the way it is. But you could tell the father was perfectionistic and frustrated with himself. I'm going to talk at the end of this talk about the good enough parent. But you have to find out how much of the remote learning you can supervise without destroying your relationship with your child, and how much you need to let your child be accountable to his or her teacher. Now, of course, the younger the children, the harder it's been for remote learning. It's just not been easy. And I know this up close and personal because my 30-year-old son is a teacher at the Bank Street School in New York. When New York was hard hit by a pandemic, he came up here and did remote teaching of first graders in the room next to me for 2.5 months. And I heard how hard it is to teach 6- and 7-year-olds remotely and to keep their attention. And I thought he and his fellow teachers were making a heroic effort to do it, but they did need more parental support. And they also need to communicate there need to be communication between teacher and parent to figure out what's the right thing and what can this child do, and does this child need, as many children did, an individual phone call with the teacher. Hearing the teacher's voice right up in their ear was somehow different from seeing them on the screen, and reconnected the kids who were dropping offline or literally falling out of the screen the way some of my son's first graders were falling out of the screen. It sometimes took an old-fashioned phone call, as amazing as Zoom is, and what a miracle it is that we can be doing this. It is not nourishing and it's not warm. And sometimes to pull children back into the learning enterprise, and certainly for teachers and parents to communicate in now their shared work of keeping this child on task with remote learning, it's been necessary to have these phone calls. A number of parents have asked me how to talk to children about tough things. And there are a lot of tough things. There are the safety precautions. There's the possibility that somebody in the family could die. And I think it's likely, if we have 50 people, I can't, what are the numbers of, we're already up into the 60s. If we have this many people on the call, it's very likely that a family has already lost a family member, maybe more than one. It may be that people have had somebody in the family hospitalized. I've asked teachers and administrators at schools around the country, what's the hardest thing been for you in the pandemic? And an administrator at school in Chicago said, my fiance was on a ventilator for 20 days and the hospital called and said, we've done all we can do for him. That was the hardest moment. Well, of course. Now, miraculously or blessedly, he recovered and was okay. But many of you have had to have tough talks with kids of various ages. And some of you had to lay down rules you didn't want to lay down. And those have led to a conflict. We're in a time where children have been soaked in information and feelings, their parents' feelings, about the election, about the Black Lives Matter movement and the racial reckoning we're in the middle of. I mean, any one of these things, a pandemic or a presidential election or a nationwide racial reckoning would have been plenty in and of itself. But we've now had three major things going on, which have produced difficult conversations with children. Let me give you my 4 guidelines for talking with children about difficult things, whether it's death, whether it's the election, how your child should behave the day after the election in the school, when there be disappointed kids and happy kids coming from disappointed or happy families. You have to be honest with your children. Children do not like their parents to lie to them, and they know it. I started out with an example of a 4.5-year-old girl who clearly knew her parents were trying to keep something from her. That is, that people could die from COVID. You need to be honest and authentic with your children. You need to be matter of fact. Don't flap. I had a mother who said to me on a Zoom call, Dr. Thompson, I'm just so worried. I'm from New York and I'm neurotic and I'm just afraid I'll flood my children with my panicky feelings. And I said to her, well, I'm with you. I'm from New York and I'm neurotic too, but it's really important not to flood your children with your fears and your panicky feeling. And you need, before you talk to your children about tough things, you need to get in a pretty good place yourself. You can tell your children you're afraid. You can tell them you've experienced a lot of anxiety. They know that anyway, but don't flood them with it. Honest, matter of fact, brief, 2-3 sentences is all. And then stop and do my 4th thing, which is ask your child what they know. And are you giving them new information? What other questions do they have? I've been giving this advice about sex education. I've been a sex educator for 40 years. And you don't flood kids with the whole story of human sexuality when they're young. If they ask a question, you say, what do you know and what would you like to know? And you add to their information. And then you say, do you want to know more? Is that enough? You know, a 7-year-old had a question about sex and was brave enough to ask it. Might say that's enough. No more is needed. But in any case, you need to check with a child of any age about how this conversation is going. So More about that in a moment when we get on chat, and we're very close to getting on chat. I want to introduce you to a concept. I've modeled my career on an English pediatrician who became, midway through his career, a psychoanalyst. His name was Donald W. Winnicott. And he did parenting shows on the BBC radio in the 60s. And all of his parenting shows were collected into a book, Winnicott. And the book is called The Child, the Family, and the Outside World. And I read that and I thought, that is so smart. That is so calming. That is so sensible. But the centerpiece of Winnicott's theory was what he called the good enough parent. The good enough parent. Not the perfect parent, not the great parent, the good enough parent. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. Your children knock you to your knees. Your children ambush you. Your children have a temperament that is hard on you, and it's hard to connect with. Your children know all of your weak spots. You know all of your children's weak spots because you installed the wiring, but they know all of your hot buttons. They can get to you. They can make you unravel, and they do. So anybody who wants to be a perfect parent, I'm so sorry that you aspire to that, because you're not going to get there. Anybody who's into competitive parenting, being a better parent than the other parents at school A or school B, forget about it, as we said in Brooklyn, right? All you can do is be a good enough parent. You'll be a disappointment to your children sometimes, and you can say you're sorry. You can blow up and be angry. You can say you're sorry. Apologizing to children is an important part of parenting. I don't mean a constant apology, but when you lose it, as all parents do, what you need to know is that the good enough parent is present enough for his or her child, that it allows the child to feel held and loved and cared about. Children will get through this pandemic if they're living with people who love them, and those people are doing the very best they can to keep them safe. Now, we have research on what happened in the bombings of London in 1939, when the Germans were bombing every night. It was a terrible, dangerous time. And there were many children who were taken from their families and out into the countryside in England to keep them physically safe. And after the war, they compared the groups of children who stayed in London under sustained bombing, but were staying in their houses with their parents, and the children are taken away from their parents. And the children who stayed in London with their parents had better mental health because they were with the people who loved them, and they could see that those people were trying to keep them safe. The children who are away from their parents became anxious and stayed anxious and had longer term traumatic effects, even though they had not been exposed to the bombing. So Andrew's now letting you know, and Andrew, you're going to come back on here because that's just about 35 minutes, isn't it? You're there you go. Now unmute. Andrew, I'm still not hearing you. I'm hoping I'll hear you soon.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Perfect. It's like a Verizon commercial.
There you go.
So yeah, people, everyone on the call, please feel free, to share your questions with Dr. Thompson. I think the most informative part, of this conversation, and it is a conversation, is going to be geared around your questions. So anything from screen time to safety, from long-term effects of the pandemic to how we might talk to children about what they're feeling or experiencing, here at school. If folks want to just take a minute and put their questions in the chat, we'll begin to start having Dr. Thompson answer them.
Although, Andrew, I may just have anticipated every question and cleaned it up in advance, right? Maybe. When you put a question in about your child, it's very helpful to me if you put the age of the child in, because the same question for a 6-year-old and an 11-year-old gets a quite different answer.
So we've got our first question, Dr. Thompson. It's from Carrie, who is a parent of a 6-year-old in our first grade. And her question is this: what do we tell our kids when they ask, when can they stop wearing masks?
What a child is expressing is an enormous amount of frustration with wearing a mask. We all get this. They are not fun. And the first thing I would do with a 6-year-old is say, are you really tired of wearing the mask? And yeah, they go, yeah. And you say, I absolutely understand. I'm tired of wearing a mask too. And I wish I could tell you that tomorrow we can stop wearing masks. But we have to wear masks as long as the virus is dangerous. And a 6-year-old should have already know from you that the virus is dangerous, otherwise they wouldn't be wearing a mask. And we can stop wearing our masks when the virus goes away or when everybody gets vaccinated. And I don't know when that's going to be. Brief, honest, I don't know, because nobody knows. And we're going to have to wear masks till then. Look, I've got heads of school talking about the possibility that we're going to be opening next fall with masks. There are independent schools that are already putting that into their planning, because they have to put it in their planning because we don't have any indication of when it's going to be safe for groups in closed buildings to go without masks. We just don't have that indication. And everybody's tired of it. Everybody's tired of it every day. And it's going to take some resolve and some empathy. But for a 6-year-old, mainly it's empathy for what a pain in the neck this is. It's hard. It's hard to be 6 and wear a mask. Again, my son is a first grade teacher, and he spends all day reminding first graders to keep the mask on. And he's pleased that most of them do it most of the time without being constantly reminded. But of course, some need to be reminded because they're 6.
So here's
sorry, I just wanted to piggyback on that. Sorry. As we talk about what we do so much with the younger students as they're in school is helping them understand the social thinking cues, watching their friends' faces to see if maybe something that they said had an impact on them, and that's something that's missing as we're teaching kids in a mask all day. So what would you say to families who need to kind of pick up a little bit of that kind of instruction? What would that look like at home so that they can help them in a space where they're not wearing a mask start to understand, facial cues and what does that mean in social constructs?
Yeah, Roxanne, it's a great question. I do think that we have to actually teach children some nonverbal cues. My colleague Michelle Anthony wrote a book about teaching sign language to nonverbal babies and toddlers, so that they wouldn't get so frustrated they could sign it. But I find myself on Zoom saying, "Give me a thumbs up if that resonates with you," or "Give me a wave," and because Zoom isn't giving me enough of the audience's face or full body reaction. I can read an audience pretty well as a psychologist and a speaker, but this damn Zoom thing doesn't work, even if people are unmasked. So I think every teacher is probably, even if she or he is not doing it intentionally, is asking for more. Not if this is true, give me a wave, give me a thumbs up. We're having to develop a non-verbal language to supplement the really the subtle expressions of the face. But we have to learn when we're not accurately reading a child.
Right.
We have to say, I'm not sure I got that. Would you spell that out for me more? We have to be following up because we can't take for granted that we've always read the cues. And that's something we can teach children. If you didn't hear what your friend was saying, children mumble, and mumbling into a mask is, oh my God, a mask is hard enough, but mumbling into a mask. And I'm getting a lot of teachers who are saying, you know, having a hard time understanding some children. So you have to slow down and stop and ask them. And what parents can do when they are with their children in mask situations is model some of that asking behavior and also giving children permission to ask those questions of each other, which are not hard. A follow-up question is not what kids do with each other. That would have to be a learned behavior, because kids don't ordinarily say, could you tell me a little bit more about that? They don't, you know, 9-year-olds don't say that to each other. They either shrug or they go on. But now, if you want to be understood by your friends and want to understand your friends, you may have to ask them that.
So another question, Dr. Thompson, you know, that came up is, how is it that, and this is from a second grade, you know, mother for a daughter, it's, how is it that we can talk to our children that not all parents are going to have the same values that we might have, i.e. following certain rules and regulations that are outlined? How is it that you go about, you know, having that conversation, but then ultimately saying you won't be able to attend that party, even though your friends might be?
Yep. No child has ever died of having a strict parent. A strict parent. I have been working in schools for many years, and there is no such thing as the average right set of rules to which everybody subscribes. There's always a range of practices. And for the most part, it's not destructive. Sometimes, you know, sometimes your 12-year-old has gone to somebody else's house and seen an R-rated movie, and you would never have allowed that. And in another house, they allowed that, but the consequences are not dire. But when it comes to safety, you have to keep your children safe in the way that you understand that you must. And your children have to accept it. And you don't have to apologize for that. You can say, sorry, sweetie, we have tougher rules about masks and getting together. The sorry is, I'm sorry you can't go, but I'm not sorry for my rules. The rules are the rules, and this is what we do in this family, and you must, right? And if you hear about your 15-year-old going out and it comes back to you that your 15-year-old's been out unmasked, they're grounded, right? And you warn them. You warn them, if I ever hear about you being out there in a group of kids and not wearing a mask, there's going to be hell to pay with me. Will 15-year-olds always pay attention to that? No, it's not in the nature of 15-year-olds. But as a parent, you've got to lay down the law as you see it, and then you can explain. Your grandmother is vulnerable. If you bring home COVID, she could die from it. I wouldn't be asking you to do this if it weren't essential. I mean, but was that 3 or 4 sentences, right? You got to wear a mask. You're in trouble if you don't wear a mask. Your grandmother's vulnerable. End of story.
Yeah, and maybe a follow-up to that, Dr. Thompson, is this comes from a kindergarten, you know, mother, is with more things opening up, you know, here in Las Vegas, right? Movie theaters, outdoor festivals. However, there's still an uncomfort, you know, level personally, you know, from families. How do they maybe explain that, you know, to a kindergartner, talking about safety, wearing a mask, all those other things? But maybe if you just kind of drill down to that a little bit more specifically.
Yeah, but you know, the more people there are, the more chance it is that somebody will have COVID. And so I can't let you go out where there are lots and lots of people. And I feel safe with the people we're seeing because at school, I trust the teachers to try and keep you safe. In our neighborhood, I trust the people to try and keep you safe. But Halloween, there are a lot of people I don't know and I don't feel safe.
Thank you. So this next question comes from the parent of an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old who happens to be doing distance learning. However, I think it could apply to all of our families. And the question is this: I'm curious what to look for as far as social regression. My kids seem to be well adjusted, but of course they lack social interaction, and that's concerning. So how do I gauge this?
They have constant social interaction. There's a 6 and an 8-year-old, and they are each other's society right now. You have to put yourself perhaps in another era or another geography. There were times when Americans were raised on family farms at vast distances from each other, and your society was your brothers, your sisters, occasional visits from your cousins, but you didn't get together with a lot of children. There's a famous American psychiatrist named Andrew Stack Sullivan. I got the middle name wrong, Andrew something. Anyway, he wrote the interpersonal theory of psychiatry about the importance of interpersonal interaction. But the interesting thing was he was raised on an isolated farm. And it cued him into how important social interactions were, but he had a relationship with his family and with animals, and it wasn't until middle school that he ever began to see other children. Does that mean he was regressed? No. And I have worked with kids who have been homeschooled for years. I've worked with a boy in northern Maine whose father was a fishing and hunting guide, and this boy knew a tremendous amount about the woods and about animals, and by the age of 14 had built a birch bark canoe with his own hands himself, but he had never had a close friend. And I encountered him at a boarding school because his parents did send him to high school for a boarding school. And he was so excited to see the other kids and so ready to see them. Was he demonstrably socially immature? He was a little naive, but he had the skill set. We are born with a social skill set. And we're born with all of the instincts to read other people's faces. I do not believe that 2 months or 4 months or 6 months of a diminished experience will throw your children into a permanent regression or leave them socially immature, particularly if they have a sibling. How can I say this with such conviction? I have an 8-year-old granddaughter, a 6-year-old granddaughter, and a 4-year-old grandson, and they are each other's playmates. Their mother, there's a lung vulnerability in one of the children, and my daughter, their mother, has kept them very, very tightly sequestered, and they have not played with any other children for 7 months. And they are playing more than they ever have. They're getting along better than they ever have, and they're fighting more than they ever have. All three things are true. They're much more resourceful with each other, and they do get on each other's nerves because they're with each other all the time.
So here's another question that just came in. It's more of a general question. And
Sure.
The parent states that they love this concept of the good enough parent because we all need a break. But how do you know, or where is their line between the good enough parent and not parenting enough? Is that up for the parent to decide, or should that state of be something that the child helps to articulate to the parent as well? So how do you navigate being good enough with, this tension of I'm not doing enough?
Right. The tension of I'm not doing enough is usually in the parent's mind. And it's a self-reproach. I need to be a better parent. And the thing is, I work with thousands of parents who think they should be better. And I respect it because I like people to want to do this very difficult job that matters so much. I want them to do it well, but I want them to give themselves a break. And I think that what you need to see is that your child is mostly occupied and content, has a good mood much of the time, and has meltdowns only rarely, and is cranky only some of the time. And that's mental health. Mental health isn't perfect happiness, and no parent has ever delivered the perfectly happy child. And in fact, when parents try too hard to have their children be happy all the time, their children become manipulators. It's easy to manipulate your parents with your unhappiness if they're knocking themselves out to make you happy every second, right? So you need to see whether your child functions and has happy moments and is engaged and is able to play. Okay, let's talk for a moment about play. Play is the signature behavior of mammals. Amphibians, reptiles don't play. Birds don't play, they have courting behaviors, but mammals play. And human beings are mammals. And you know when a child is healthy, mentally healthy, when they can play. They can play by themselves. They can play with a brother or sister. They can play with a friend. But if you see a child who's capable of moving back and forth between doing schoolwork and playing, and schoolwork and playing, and being tender and loving and having some meltdowns, you're seeing a mentally healthy child. But what we look for as therapists, when a child is sent to us as depressed or anxious, usually what's missing in their lives because of their depression or their anxiety is they can no longer play. They're too anxious to play or too sad to play. That's poor mental health. And what you want to do is get a child who's been very anxious to let enough of the anxiety go, have that anxiety reduced enough by therapy, counseling, or actually medication, that they can play again. And the moment a child starts to play it again, as a therapist, I get the hell out, because play beats therapy. And I want you to adopt that as a parent. If your child is able to play for stretches of time, by herself, by himself, or with others, you're probably doing a good enough job of parenting. Can you measure it that way? I think you can.
No, thank you for that. I think, and just to dovetail on that question, and answer, there's another question here from a parent of multiple lower school children. And she says, our kids are blessed in so many ways, the most of which is attending an independent school that has on-campus learning. And I find I'm not good at comforting them when they are experiencing angst over what I perceive as small losses, when there are children without food, parents without jobs, racial divisiveness. I want them to have perspective and to think about others less fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
How do we have that conversation with kids when we're also navigating, this pandemic and COVID times?
Right. I worked for many years with the head of a girls' school in Toronto. And this was a wonderful independent school, superb academically, very high tuition. It was a great school. And when very minor niggling complaints came in from girls who were outraged that they couldn't have this or that, the head would say in the privacy of her office, "Suck it up, buttercup." And as a parent, when you are providing a safe home, a wonderful school, and you know that your children are lucky, I know that moment. I've wanted to say it to my own grandchildren. I certainly wanted to say it to my own children. Suck it up, buttercup. But kids don't actually take that very well if you just say that to them. So even though your feeling is suck it up, buttercup, what you can say to them is, sweetie, I know this is troubling you, but I want you to know that in the world, in the overall scheme of things, we are very lucky, and you are very lucky. And one of the things I need you to learn is to be grateful for what you've got and not over-focused on what you don't. And you don't slam them with it. You don't slam them with it. But you say, I need to teach you to be grateful. And of course, church-going people have a language for this that's provided in the prayers of thanks to God, and people who say grace at the table and thank God for their food. Their children are, in fact, being taught both humility and gratitude. And I would just say, I've seen a lot of children in my career, and gratitude and humility are two of the most attractive traits in children. It's a thing worth teaching children, but it doesn't always come naturally to them because they feel their grievances and their losses the way we all do, but they feel them and they're raw and they feel they don't have control, so they complain. Now, my sister-in-law would say to her boys when they complain, she would always laugh and say, oh, do you want some cheese with your wine? Well, that's getting back into the suck it up, buttercup territory. And I actually believe you can say that with some humor to a 12-year-old boy who is going on and on about his grievances, right? Would you like some a cheese with your wine? I only knew it in my own family as now part of an ad with Patrick Stewart and Mark Hamill, that phrase. And Patrick Stewart calls Mark Hamill out, if you've seen that ad for Uber Eats. Do you want some cheese with your wine? Adolescents, you can tease them about whining and complaining. Younger children, it's better to say, it's enough. I don't want to hear more about this. You're very lucky in the scheme of things. And I'm going to try and show you that in the scheme of things, you're very lucky.
No, thank you. And I think one thing that you touched upon in the opening kind of comments is, yes, we're living in pandemic times. We're also living in political times,
Yep.
as well. And so this question's a little bit, more of a pivot, to sort of this current climate, that
Right.
we're living in as well. And so the question is, my sons are 8, 10, and 12. Come home and share with me conversations about politics they have with their friends.
Yep.
It's clear from what they share that some of this subject matter is over their heads. But the question is this: how do we talk with our kids about politics and go about discussing politics appropriately, with others as well?
Yeah. So you find out first with a child of any age what they make of it,
Mm-hmm.
what they make of the intensity of the conversation, and what they make of the issues. So you want to understand what they're hearing and what they understand from it. That will cue you as to how you can add to it. And there are a couple of things you can ask. Do you want to know more about this issue? Do you want to know more about what I think about this issue? Or do you want to talk to me about what you wish you'd said to your friends? When a kid comes home and just delivers, says there was this conversation going on, blah, 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 you may not know what the child is asking you. And so I would ask those kinds of follow-up questions to find out where the kids, or maybe they just want you to listen. A lot of the time kids just want their parents to listen to them, and you should shut up and listen. And not give advice and not give good counsel because they're not that interested in it anyway. They just want to tell you because it was an exciting part or an unnerving part of the school day. You can ask that. When were your friends fighting about politics? Was that hard for you? Did you have friends who disagreed? How did you handle them? What did you think? Do you have disagreements, political disagreements with your other friends? Now, if they say what many children want to know is how you, the parent, are handling political conflict. And this is where you have to boil it down and get matter of fact. I've been talking to a number of schools who are worried about a conflict the day after the election, because there was a lot of conflict in independent schools the day after the election. And it took a lot of teachers by surprise. I think that you can say a couple of things to your child. One is, this is a very important election and people are deeply involved in it. Some people hate the president. Some people love the president. The feelings are running strong. And do you know that? You can ask your child, do you know that? Do you hear that? Oh, yeah, okay. So on the day after the election, you have to treat your classmates well. And the classmates are upset because their candidate lost. You don't taunt them. You don't tease them. And if you're pleased and excited, you also don't over celebrate. And I go right away. I work at a boys' school, so athletic analogies always work. And I say to boys, you know, in the NFL, if somebody does a big end zone dance, what happens? What happens in the NFL if you do a big end zone dance? Penalty, right? We don't allow taunting in the NFL, and we don't allow taunting in this school, and we won't have it. If you're pleased, you can say you're pleased. If you're disappointed, you can say you're disappointed. But to refight it in an unpleasant way, or taunt or trade accusations, no. In this school, Alexander Dawson School, any school, it must be civil and it must be respectful, because we have to live together day after day. We have to live together and we have to protect ourselves as a community.
Thank you for that, Dr. Thompson. So another question is, this is more of a general question from one of our actually administrators, is how soon should you prepare kids about upcoming family traditions that will look different this year? Is there any language or phrases that parents can use to help with these conversations as we prepare, you know, to maybe not even get together?
Yeah, I'm worried we're not going to be able to get together. I'm not sure we can get together as a family this year. It's killing me. I think they need to hear your feelings about it, because they're going to have feelings about it. And it's your feelings about it. There's no parent who, did anybody hear Anthony Fauci talking about not being able, he and his wife, I mean, they're close to 80. And he was saying that they were not going to be able to see any of their 3 children. And I thought it was just lovely. You know, it was just lovely. We're not sure we're going to be able to see our grandchildren this Thanksgiving, and maybe not Christmas. And I have had many, many conversations with grandparents about this. It makes us all heartsick, and it's a loss. And you just have to address the loss by saying, yes, if we may not be able to do it, if we're not able to do it, it's going to make me very sad. And we're going to have to try and make it as fun as we can. That's 3 sentences. We may not be able to do it. It's going to make me very sad. And we're going to have to do the best we can to make it feel like a Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe along those lines too, do you think that a parent's overall attitude towards pandemic or school closures are influencing their kids' attitude? What is your advice to parents who find themselves being negative about our overall climate?
Suck it up, Buttercup. I'm sorry. Now that that's in my head, look, parents, you're going to have to get your feelings under control. You're going to have to go for a walk, talk to a friend, and if you're feeling negative and irritable, and Lord knows I have been negative and irritable in the past 7 months. I don't know what you do, but you have to figure out what you can do, because your children will model on you. And if you're excessively negative, you're entitled to say, I'm hating this. This is frustrating. I'm not having a good day. Fine. But day after day after day of negativity, and that does tend to flood your kids, and it does tend to infect their mood. And they may not have found the pandemic as frustrating as you have. I'm getting a lot of stories about families where the kids are thinking, hey, we're at home. We got more screen time than we ever have. And this isn't such a bad deal, right? And there are a lot of kids who are on a bus in ordinary school times who've not been on a bus 7 or 8 hours a week, right? And that's not, nobody thinks bus is that such high quality time. There's some kids who have really enjoyed it. Let me give you an example. This is last spring when my grandchildren were in the first months of remote learning. Except that the public schools of Northern New Hampshire were not doing a good job of it at all. It was mainly worksheets. It was at-home learning, but it wasn't remote. They weren't seeing their teacher. They were getting worksheets. And I called one afternoon around 4 to kind of check with my daughter on the day. And I could tell she was frustrated. And being the supervisor of worksheets, she'd had it. She just had it. And she'd sent them out into the backyard 3 hours earlier. And I said, well, can I see the grandkids? And she took the iPad to the back door and called them. And my granddaughter Aubrey came running up, sweating, happy, looking like she'd been enjoying the outdoors. And I said, Aubrey, how you doing? I understand you've had a long recess. And she said, yes, it's been 3 hours, a 3-hour recess. And she was absolutely exultant. But her mom had crashed and burned as the supervisor. They do have a backyard where she could have a 3-hour recess. They got a dog. They have a swing set. They have lots to do out there. And I could tell the mom was unhappy and the kids were happy. It's important when you're cranky and unhappy that you let your kids play and not infect them with your mood. It's important that you be away from them so you can do whatever your play is, get what you need done, relax in whatever way you can, so that you're back to being a good enough parent, not a chronically cranky one.
I have a question, Andrew, really quickly. There was a parent with a child, a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, who asked the question about connecting with grandparents. And
yes.
You mentioned earlier that Zoom is not warm. And so it sounds like sometimes it's hard because the kids aren't engaging in video chat, or they're reluctant to want to video chat with their grandparents. Yet they need to stay connected with their grandparents. So how do you help in a situation like that?
Keep them short and frequent. The grandparents always want more, and but it's you have to settle sometimes. In the example I just gave, here was the grandfather interrupting the play in the backyard. So all I got was, "We're great, we're playing. See you, pop up." That's it. I have found that grandchildren will for a while go through reading together, and then they lose interest in it and it starts to feel obligatory to them. whatever works for whatever time, that's the thing you should try and do. But as a grandparent, you have to go into a call with very low and flexible expectations. And that's a little hard. My wife and I have found it personally hard. But if you weigh the call down with expectations, then the grandkids will kind of dread it. The call will have that sort of guilt-inducing obligatory feel, which they don't want. Yeah. Oh, and I just, it's a personal thing to me. I am an absolute postcard maven. I could reach up on my shelf and bring down 2 boxes of Disney postcards, each of 100 postcards a piece, which are now, both boxes are down to about 25 postcards, because I keep in touch, I ask questions, I do things, but I get things in a mailbox, so it isn't all just Zoom, that I'm communicating in other ways. And I will admit I might have sent some gifts, I'm just saying.
I have another question from a parent here. We've talked about how to talk to kids who are seeing that other classmates are at parties or get-togethers, but this one is specific about sports and the fear of missing out, not just on the social activity of sports, but seeing classmates and friends continue to compete in sports and keep getting better in that area, and for a child to be told, yep, that's not something we're doing. How do you handle that kind of conversation?
Okay. This is a real tough one, and I'm at the psychologist for a highly athletic boys' school. And a number of our boys are hoping to come to the attention of a college coach eventually. So this is hit them hard. Mm-hmm. Here's the deal. What I'm hearing around the country is the cases of COVID that are coming into independent schools are being brought by kids playing club sports outside school. The cases that we've had at Belmont Hill this fall have been brought in by kids who've gone out to tournaments. And then we end up quarantining the kid who's tested positive and all their buddies. And the boys at my school are getting it. We closed down our sports program. Roxanne, do you have your sports program up and running?
We do not.
No. And it's killing our boys. It's for many of boys, it is a really hard and grievous loss. And there are parents who can't say no to their boys, and so they're playing a lot of club sports. But the problem is it's uncontrolled. Mm-hmm. And it represents a risk to the community. So I know the director of a school in the Midwest, and she has told her parents, she runs a K through 8 school. She has told her parents, you can make a choice. She's tough. This is a really tough head of school. And she said to her parents, you can make a choice between in-person learning for your child or club sports. Mm-hmm. It's a choice. If your child plays club sports, they have to come to school on remote learning. Mm-hmm. And there are parents who are absolutely ripped with her. They are furious with her. But she's saying, I'm trying to protect the community. And so given that sports seem to be the central form of transition, you have to say to kids, this is a huge loss. I acknowledge the loss. I hate that we have to ask you to not play sports. I hate it for you. And then you have to find something that you can do to get your child outside. Mm-hmm. I talked to a wealthy parent in Westchester County who'd managed to get a tennis coach to play frequently. The child, because I hadn't thought about tennis as the ultimate. It's one of the ultimate social distancing sports, and it certainly is. I live on a lake that is bordered by Arlington and Medford, Massachusetts, and the Tufts sailing team sails on this lake, and they always in their boats have 2 people, and they compete. I get to watch sailing competitions. They're all one person in a boat, That also turns out to be good social distancing. But there are sports that can be done in a social distancing way. And biking can, and tennis can, and sailing can. And you can walk in a socially distant way, and you can hike in a socially distant way. I hiked with my grandchildren this summer. Their father and the two girls. We did some real good hikes, but we did it socially distanced, and I wore a mask. And it's not fun to hike. It's not as much fun, but we were able to hike together. There are things you can do, and where you can keep your kids' bodies fit, and where they can get some strenuous exercise. And I think you should work on whatever you can do. I don't know what sport it is. Tennis, canoeing, sailing, hiking, on and on. There are sports you can do. And you tell them when they get back, they will be fit. And the friends they think are so much farther ahead of them won't be any or they're ahead of them in fitness than they will be. They're going to be okay.
Thank you.
So maybe I think we've got time for a couple more, questions. One that popped up earlier was, you're talking, this is coming from a kindergarten parent, and the question is how to communicate to kids that they and their friends and family might get coronavirus, and it doesn't mean they'll die. And how can you convey the importance of following strict rules, but also too, the virus isn't deadly to everyone, right? And sort of the bifurcation of those two topics, particularly to kindergarten and elementary, age students.
Right. So as of about 3 weeks ago, only, and the word is stupid in this context because it's a catastrophic loss, only 100 children under the age of 10 have died in the United States of COVID. So in fact, it's an extremely rare event. And you can say to a child, children don't die of this unless they have some other illness. And I think you're likely to get through it. You don't have to have a lot of science, but you can say to them, I am not worried about that for you. I am worried about it for you're giving it to somebody else, especially older people, because 95% of the people who've died of this have been older. But we have to keep everybody safe by not spreading it around. It's not that it's going to kill you. We can't spread it around. And you can boil down the science so it's understandable to small children, and you can reassure them, and that's a scientific fact too. It is not appropriate to say that children never get it. It's not appropriate to say that all children are going to be fine if they get it. You can say that at whatever age, the sense is the vast majority of children don't even have much symptoms. There's that tiny minority that are unsafe, but I wouldn't dwell on that with a child because you have an overwhelming percentage that allows you to speak from it accurately and scientifically and tell the truth. Does that work for you, Andrew?
Dr. Thompson, I want to go back to something you said about sleep. We're a challenge success school, so we are always advocating for kids to get the proper amount of sleep a night. We had Sleep Week a few years ago where our kids actually, promoted it. What kind of advice do you have for families who might be sharing that, their kids are having trouble sleeping during this time? Like, what kind of advice do you give to really help kids get the appropriate amount of sleep that they need?
Okay, there are a couple of things. First of all, Americans are an underslept nation. The tallest people on earth now are the Dutch. I don't know if you've ever, have you been to Amsterdam recently or seen a plane flying from Amsterdam? Go watch a plane flying from Amsterdam. The Dutch are the tallest people on earth. And people have wondered about it, whether it's the diet. They eat a lot of cheese and milk, and they're not all vegans or something. They sleep. Their children sleep. The Dutch believe in rest and routine. And actually, as a country, they're now the tallest people on earth. We don't get enough sleep, and it affects our growth. It affects our obesity. It affects all kinds of things. Children need 8 to 10 hours of sleep. This is a thing that every parent should fight about and be thoughtful about. And this is where rest and routine, the devices get turned off an hour and a half before bedtime. If the early adolescent kids are sneaking their devices in their room, and you have to have a server you can shut down. But this is something you can be a little crazy about with your kids and say, there are other things I don't care about, but I care about sleep. I care about sleep. 8 to 10 hours, 8 to 10 hours. And you can say to a 16-year-old, I know you don't want to sleep as much, that you don't go to bed as early as you once did. But if you get less than 8 hours, you're hard to be with. And you're cranky, and we all pay a price for it. And as a family member, we need you to get sleep for you, and we need you to get sleep for us. Sleep is a thing, I think, sleep and hydration, right? Come on, basic.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I think if between Roxanne and I, we've gotten to almost all questions, but one that, I've seen is, this comes from the parent of an 8-year-old. It's also an only child, and it's a parent that is getting bored with his parents being his playmates and his caretakers.
Right.
What can we do to keep him from feeling the more negative effects of being an only child without siblings during a pandemic?
Yeah, well, see, it isn't a disaster for them, because only children, their ground of existence, as the European psychoanalysts used to describe it, for only child, the ground of existence is that he or she lives in a world with 2 adults who adore him or her. And that's the right configuration. 3, with 2 doting on and adoring the one. And for most only children, that is pretty much a good thing. And many only children have a way of entertaining themselves and playing by themselves. But this has been a long time now. And I would encourage a family, if their health situation allowed them to bring a cousin into that bubble, bring a neighborhood friend into that bubble. Is there another family whose sequestering and safety practices are ones that you trust? If you could bring another family with a child whom your child likes, it would be a gift, particularly for 2 only children, but it would be a gift to your child if you could do it safely.
We got one at the last minute sneaking in here, Dr. Thompson.
Okay.
We're gonna do our best to make sure we
Okay.
give our parents what they want, and it's this. Here's the question. I have a 10-year-old boy. Since the pandemic has begun, his screen time has increased enormously, especially video game time, which has been his only way to interact with friends. What's the best way to limit video game time and to improve his focus and sharpness?
Oh, so you're not just limiting, you're improving his focus and sharpness. My guess is his sharpness and focus on his video games is very, very high, that he's really sharp and focused. You want him to be sharp and focused on school, which is not as motivating for him as video games. Look, as I said earlier, I may come across as a slacker psychologist. I think the rules have been relaxed in every home about video gaming. What I want is 8 to 10 hours of sleep. I want schoolwork done, and I want there to be times when the whole family is together without devices. The rest of his free time, if he's relating to his friends on video games, I am not going to get worked up about that. I don't think it's a battle that I want to fight. There also has to be some exercise, and healthy exercise. But if this is a boy who's at Dawson and back in-person learning, I'm I first imagined this was a 10-year-old boy who was on all remote learning. If he's doing a school day and getting his homework done and having dinner with his family without devices and getting to 8 or 10 hours of sleep, I'm not going to fight over the difference between 3 hours and 2 hours of video game. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson. This has been, I think illuminating and helpful, for us as a school. We appreciate your wisdom and your thoughts, and thank you so much for all of our parents who spend time out of their morning, joining us and listening to you. So thank you all.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks,
Yeah.
Roxanne. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And
Brandon, Megan.
Yeah. Just a really quick thank you from my end as well. I want to give a shout out to our Parent Association because they put on events throughout the entire year that help us fund our parent university. And it is such a core of excellence for us that we get to come together and have this community so we do not feel like we're parenting alone. And as you mentioned, like, this is one of the most challenging times to be a parent. It's not fair. It's not easy. You're making decisions that are life-changing, and you're doing it while having your own fear and anxiety about what's going on in the world. And so the most we can do for our families is to say, you're not alone. Let's come together and talk about all of these questions and concerns and fears that help us strengthen our family framework. And that's what you did for us today, Dr. Thompson, is given our whole community some strategies and tools that will help us know who we are as parents and what's important to us in our relationship with our kids. And I thank you for that.
Thank you, Roxanne.
All right. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. This is a recording, and so please share it with friends and family who you think would really get some help from this conversation today.